So I'll begin with a story. Back in the 1700s, in the days of the saintly Baal Shem Tov, there was someone in the community who was deathly ill. And the family came running to the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov was this great mystic, a miracle worker. And they said, Rebbe, please do something. Say a prayer. We need a miracle. Save a life. The Baal Shem Tov asked that a special wax candle be prepared. He went out to the forest and he placed the candle by a certain tree. And then he invoked a special prayer. And these mystical meditations and phrases, whatever it was that he recited, but sure enough, the blessing came and the person had a miraculous recovery. Years later, a similar incident takes place, but it takes place this time with the Baal Shem Tov's successor, the Maggid of Mizrich. The Baal Shem Tov had passed on, the Maggid had taken his place, and again, a life is hanging in the balance. The family comes to the Maggid and they ask for a Baal Shem Tov style miracle. Can you pull off what the Baal Shem Tov pulled off? So like his predecessor, the Maggid asked that a wax candle be prepared. He went out to the same forest. He went to the same tree that the Baal Shem Tov visited. And he said the following: the special prayers that my master, the Baal Shem Tov, said, I do not know. But here is the forest, here is the tree, and here is the candle. May the merit of my master help bring about my blessing. Baal Shem Tov up there, you pull it off because I don't know what you did. And the miracle happened, and a blessing came. A generation later, a similar crisis, a matter of life and death. A miracle was needed. This time, the leader was Rabbi Moshe D of Sasov. Rabbi Moshe D said, the prayers of the Baal Shem Tov, I do not know. Which forest he went to, I do not know. Which tree he went to, I do not know. What was special about that candle that he asked to be prepared, I do not know. But what I do know is the story of the Baal Shem Tov doing all of that. So I will tell the story of the Baal Shem Tov. And with that, hopefully the blessing will come. And so it was. Most emblematic of Jews and Judaism more than anything else is our stories. We tell stories. We have a fascination with stories. We have an obsession with stories. We tell them like nobody else. There's a reason why so many Jews are involved in Hollywood, in the movie industry, because we tell stories. We've always told stories. For thousands of years, we've told stories. And good movie making is good storytelling. Indeed, every aspect of our lives is animated, is informed, is enriched by stories. Think about it. From the 5 books of Moses, the books of the prophets, the Medrash, the Talmud, the stories of the Baal Shem Tov, Hasidic stories throughout the generations, from the golden years of Spain and the Spanish Inquisition, the flourishing European Jewry, and the Holocaust. From modern-day Israel to the blossoming of Judaism in America. Stories. Millions of stories. We're about to celebrate Passover. What do we do by the Seder night? We tell a story. The Haggadah, it's all about storytelling. Sukkot, it's about the story of our ancestors in the wilderness. Purim, the story of Mordechai and Esther. Hanukkah, the stories of the Maccabees. Well, what do we do by these holidays? We get together with family and with friends, and we tell stories. We tell the stories to our children. We tell the stories to our grandchildren. You see, a good Jewish story is not just there to amuse us, but to entertain us. A good Jewish story is rich in symbolism and meaning. It's instructive. It's inspiring. It can break through barriers that sometimes prayers cannot. A good Jewish story builds bridges across the vast oceans of time and space. As somebody once said, a storyteller, like a travel agent, can gather us from wherever we are and put us down in another setting. Like a heavenly chariot, a good Jewish story transports us to new places of wisdom and wonder. And so, my friends, in the course of my talk tonight, I hope to take you on a journey aboard such a chariot. But at the same time, I hope that together we might reach for a higher dimension of what a Jewish story can be. And that is where the story itself comes to life. The story comes to life not in 2D or 3D, but in real time. Rabbi Moshe D couldn't find that forest. He didn't know the Kabbalistic formula, but by telling the story, he recreated the spiritual power of that event, and thus the miracle took place. And that's the ultimate of a Jewish story. And that's why we tell stories on the holidays. Not so much to remember, but to reenact, to relive it. You never know where the next great Jewish story might be born. There are new Jewish stories unfolding all around us all the time. And of course, nowhere are greater Jewish stories born than on the streets of Jerusalem. The very stones of Jerusalem have stories to tell. So I begin my first story in Jerusalem. Years ago, not too long ago, because the fellow of the story just passed away a few years ago, if you visited the Kotel, especially early in the morning, the Western Wall, you may have noticed there was an elderly man wearing a guard's uniform, and his job was to organize, to make sure the books are put away, to make sure the little tables that were there were put away. That was his role. And when the notes overflowed in the wall, his job was to collect them and have them buried. Recently, again, just passed away. Before his passing, someone had the opportunity to talk to this man and to ask him, "You're an elderly man. They could find someone younger. What is it that you're doing?" And of course, he had a story to share. His name was Binyamin Wurzberger. Binyamin Wurzberger came from Hungary. As a teenager, he was sent to the camps, where he was forced to drag heavy railroad and lay tracks for the Germans. When it came time to eat, he would just have a few minutes to grab whatever scraps they would throw at the prisoners that day, if any at all. But for all the horrors, there was one memory that stayed with him. Every day, while standing in line for his scraps, there was a Nazi commander who would stand there and taunt them. And he would say to them, "Do you dream of getting to Jerusalem? I bet you do." And then with this sadistic laugh, he would say, "It's possible, you know." And he would point to the smoke coming out of the crematoria. And he would say, your ashes, maybe they will blow to Jerusalem, but you will never make it to Jerusalem. Every day, Binyamin Wurzberger would hear this Nazi taunt him with this, pointing to the smoke. Your ashes may get to Jerusalem. I was beaten, he said. I was humiliated. I was starved. I was worked literally to the bone. In later years, I was sent on one of those horrible death marches of which only a handful survived. But every day, I would hear those words, and I would will myself to keep on going, so that one day I would show him, and I would make it to Jerusalem. I was the only member of my family to survive the Holocaust. After many journeys, I made it to Israel. I got married and raised a beautiful family. And when I retired from my job, my wife and children thought that I would stay home and relax. but I had one more mission in life. I walked into the offices of the Western Wall Heritage Foundation, the organization that maintains and renovates the area of the Kotel, and I said, I want to work for you. Well, they looked at me and they said, you know, you're an old man. We're not exactly hiring people in your age bracket. We look for younger people. And he said, I'm not asking for a salary. I need to work here. I will do anything you need. I don't want to be paid a cent. Just let me work here. Trust me, you won't be disappointed. And so Binyamin Wurzberger was given the task of coming at 5 a.m., cleaning the stones of the Kotel, and that began his labor of love, of making sure the place was clean and ready for the thousands that would come for the morning services. And he said, when I stand near the holy stones, I hear the words of that Nazi officer, and I look at the thousands of my Jewish brothers and sisters proudly praying at the wall, and I smile. For this I live. Each and every single one of us have our own Jewish story that are deeply personal and speak to us directly. Stories that send us messages that if we tuned in and we know how to recognize them as such, we would feel the power of the story. A number of years ago, there was a woman who lived in Ramat Gan, Israel. Mrs. Lerner had a job working for a company which basically enabled her to support her family. And she felt very fortunate. Economic times in Israel at that time was quite tough, and she was lucky she had a job. The problem was she was 3 months pregnant, early in the pregnancy. And the big question was, would she still have a job waiting for her when she left to take care of her baby? Apparently at that time, maternity leave and labor laws were not quite as dependable in Israel years ago. So there was no guarantee that if she took a month or 2 or 3 off, that there would be a job. And to make matters worse, her husband had been out of work for 6 months. Her brother, who had been living with them, was also unemployed. So she was the breadwinner. She was the salary coming in. And she couldn't lose that job, and she knows she's pregnant. And she figures that although we don't publicize our pregnancy in the 3rd month, we usually wait till the 5th month, she needs to speak to her boss because this anxiety of what's going to be is really stressing her out. And so one afternoon, the owner of the company, Mr. Fisher, came by the workplace, and they was having lunch in the cafeteria where the employees would take their lunch breaks. And it was rather an informal setting, and she figured, you know, this is a better place rather than making an appointment with him in his office. It's very intimidating. We're sitting eating lunch. This would be a good time to sit next to him and to have this conversation. And so she did. She sat down next to Mr. Fisher. And Mrs. Lerner starts explaining, I'm not sharing this publicly, but I want you to know. I'm 3 months pregnant. I also want you to know my husband is unemployed. My brother is unemployed. It's the only income. And I need some assurances from you that after I take maternity leave, there's a job waiting for me. And Mr. Fisher didn't commit. He said, we'll see how things are. Hopefully there'll be a need. The person that will replace, if we can find someone temporary. It wasn't what she was looking for. She wanted certainty. Now, other people started sitting around the table and the subject changed, and they started chatting about their past history, where they came from. Some came from America, some came from other countries, and the subject turned, it changed. And Mrs. Lerner was asked, where do you originally come from? And she said she's from Brooklyn. She made Aliyah from East Flatbush, the East Flatbush section of Brooklyn. Mr. Fisher was interested in that. Asked, where did you live? Started asking other questions about what block did you live on? What did your parents do? What did your grandparents do? On other types of questions. He seemed very interested in her background, and then he left the room. He came back, and it was very clear that his face was red. And he calmly tells Mrs. Lerner that I need to tell you a story. Many years ago, There were two electricians who lived in the same neighborhood in East Flatbush. One of these electricians was a union member. He worked for a large company and he was very successful. The other was a non-union electrician man, and he constantly struggled to make a living. He would wait for the phone to ring and maybe get a job. Maybe he would get 1 job a week, 2 jobs a week, but it was hard to make a living. These two men attended the same synagogue. They weren't really close friends, but they davened together on Shabbos, and they would walk each other home because they were going in the same direction. One day, tragedy struck. The poor non-union electrician had a massive heart attack, and within a few days he passed away. When the other electrician came to the house of Shiva to pay condolences to the mourners, he couldn't help but notice the poverty, the state of poverty of the home. And now there's a widow with 6 children. He was a bit nosy, so he walked into the kitchen and he opened the fridge. And he saw that it was just about empty. And he opened the pantry, and it too was empty. That's all he needed to see. He went right to his car, right to the market, loaded it up with everything you could think of, to the kosher butcher, to the kosher baker, loaded it up, and just came parading into this house of Shiva, bag after bag after bag. Now this wasn't a one-time thing. Because every day of Shiva, he made certain that there was breakfast, that there was lunch, that there was dinner. And then after Shiva was over, he continued his mitzvah. He continued bringing food to this widow's home. And as much as the widow said, please, it's enough, you've done enough, he wouldn't listen. And one time the widow says to this other electrician, you know, my husband left in the basement all this electrical supplies. To me, it's junk. But to you, it probably has value. Why don't you take from it anything you need? So he said, let me take a look. And he goes down to the basement, and sure enough, it's a mess, but there's boxes of all electrical supplies, a lot of stuff that had some value. And he said, do you mind if every day after work I come to this basement and I start organizing it? And that's what he did for weeks, every day after work, organizing stuff. And then he put out a notice. This was before the era of WhatsApp or emails. He made little signs, flyers, that he passed around. Anyone in the electrical business that wants to buy stuff, there will be a wholesale sale. He made a bazaar out of electrical equipment, and he collected $10,000 worth. He's collected $10,000 out of material that he sold, and he gave it to this widow. Now, for her to receive out of nowhere $10,000, it was tremendous for her. The workers are there in the cafeteria in Ramat Gan and listening to Mr. Fisher tell the story, not understanding where is the story going. And he then turns to Mrs. Lerner and he says, the electrician who organized that sale, who brought food to this house, who took care of that widow and her children, was your grandfather, Tzvi Ackerman. And I was one of those 6 orphans who watched him do it. It was my father who died at a young age. And my brothers and my sisters, we were just kids, but none of us have ever forgotten your Zaidi, what he did for our mother and what he did for us during those very dark, painful days. Mrs. Lerner, make no mistake, you will always have a job with this company. But more than that, tomorrow morning, please have your husband and your brother come with you to work, because they will be given jobs here as well. That night, the tearful Mrs. Lerner went home and sent a letter to her grandfather, who was still alive. All it said was, thank you, Zaidi. I'm so proud to be your granddaughter. A man in Brooklyn, New York, sees the despair of the family and decides to seize that moment and do something about it. Not because he has any idea that 2 generations from now, his own granddaughter would need a job, that her husband would need a job, that her brother would need a job. He just did the right thing. And now it pays itself back in Ramat Gan, Israel, decades later. We hear a story like that and it makes us stop and think the next opportunity that we have to do an act of kindness, to do an act of sharing. Make it part of your story. Before the Baal Shem Tov passed away, he gave out assignments to all of his disciples. He gave them each a mission that he wanted them to carry out after his passing. And to one of them he said, your mission is to go out there and tell the stories that you witnessed when you made your travels with me. Tell stories about the Baal Shem Tov after I pass away. That's a rather strange job. Baal Shem Tov was a humble man, and for him to want stories told about him was very much against his personality. And besides, what kind of living could you make telling stories? Not everyone pays top dollar for that. So he asks his master, his teacher, and how long should I do that? How many years do you want me to invest in that? And the answer from the Baal Shem Tov was, you will know when the time has come for you to move on to something else. You won't need me to tell you when, you'll figure it out. And so indeed, after the Baal Shem Tov's passing, this chassid started going from town to town, city to city, relating the incredible tales of the Baal Shem Tov. One day, this chassid was told that there's a wealthy nobleman. He lives near the Polish border, quite a distance. And that this nobleman has put out word that he pays handsomely to anyone that could visit him and tell him stories of the Baal Shem Tov. This is perfect for you. Yes, it's a long journey, but the guy wants to pay. That's exactly what you do. And so the chassid collects whatever money he needs, borrows some money to make this long journey, a journey of weeks and weeks and weeks, until he arrives at this border town. And he arrives at this mansion and he knocks on the door and he tells the doorkeeper that he is a former disciple of the Baal Shem Tov and he has stories to tell. The doorkeeper escorts him to the study hall where the nobleman is sitting behind his desk, and the nobleman says, wonderful, please, start speaking, tell me some stories. He's about to tell his first story and his mind goes blank. Can't think of a single. Nothing. So the nobleman says, you must be tired, you've been traveling for weeks. Not a problem, I have a guest house. You'll rest up, you'll wake up in the morning, you'll have something to eat, and then we'll get together, you'll tell stories. No problem. He goes to the guest house, he rests up, he wakes up in the morning, he davens, he has something to eat, the nobleman is there, new, time to tell some stories. Nothing there. Nothing. Wait till after dinner, nothing. Wait a few days, it's going to come to you. If you were a disciple of the Baal Shem Tov, it will come to you. It could be the long journey has caused a little amnesia here, but don't worry, I have patience. You can stay as long as you want. He's there day in, day out. Nothing. He can't understand. I know all the stories. There's no one that knew more stories than I. I've told more stories. No one has told more stories than I. And now, nothing. He waits and waits and he realizes it's not happening. Maybe this was the sign that the Baal Shem Tov meant, you'll know when this career has come to an end. But does it have to be this way? All the money he borrowed to make the trip, he's not going to be able to ask the nobleman for money now after all of that. And he comes to the nobleman and he says, I'm so sorry, but it's time to give it up. It's obviously not going to happen. So the nobleman says, one more day. One more day. Let's try one more day. The next day, nothing doing. And he's ready to leave. He's all packed. And as he walks out the door, he remembers one story. One story comes to mind. And he runs to the nobleman. I have to tell it right now before I forget it. He says, I remember a man once came to see the Baal Shem Tov. He was very upset. And he said, Rabbi, I used to be a God-fearing Jew. But you know, the temptations of the outside world beckoned, and I felt that my Jewish identity was depriving me of the pleasures of the world. So I converted out of the faith. I became very rich and very successful. But not only did I abandon my religion, not only did I abandon my people, not only did I abandon my faith, I despised the Jewish people because it made me feel guilty. So I did everything to hurt my fellow Jews, and I caused a lot of pain. And I would seek any opportunity to conspire against the Jews of my community. Recent events, however, in my life have led me to realize how vile and how wrong our behavior has been. And so I'm begging you, pave a way for me back. I want to come back home. I want to be back amongst my people. But I know I need repentance. I need you to tell me what to do. And the Baal Shem Tov proceeded to tell this man different things that he should do. Prayers that he should say, kindness that he should show the Jewish community, how he should make his way back. And if you continue on this path, you will be forgiven. So he asked the Baal Shem Tov, and how will I know that I'm forgiven? To which the Baal Shem Tov said, you will know when one day you hear this story told to you. And as the man is saying this story, he's looking closer at the nobleman, putting two and two together. And he realized, you're the man. I saw you decades ago having this conversation with the Baal Shem Tov. And the nobleman understood that the reason he was forgetting, he couldn't remember a single story, was he wasn't there yet. So he would spend every day in fasting and praying, begging, let him remember the story and tell me the story so that I know. So the nobleman now knows that he's forgiven, and the storyteller now knows that he can find another career. When two Jews meet and share a story, you never know. You never know if that story is the one that your soul has been waiting and craving to hear for so long. And now that you've heard it, your life will never be the same again. Because that story was really your story. And you waited for that moment for someone that you were having an encounter with to share that story with you. That story is God's way of tapping you on the shoulder and saying, there's something I need you to do. I gave you special talents and gifts so that you can go forth and paint your masterpiece and shine your light. Let's understand, not all of us are inspired or compelled to create masterpieces, large scales, nor do we have to. Our daily lives can become masterpieces. We have our own places and our own situations where we shine, where we can make a difference, where we can have an impact. The key is to perk up to your story when you hear it and respond to it by writing a story of your own. Life is not only about the big and about the impressive. It's not only about the great moments of inspiration and motivation. It's not only about the times we're facing tumultuous events. Life is about what happens every single day. In the words of motivational speaker Zig Ziglar, he said, when people say, what's the point of getting all inspired and motivating? Motivation doesn't last. I say, bathing doesn't either. That's why I recommend it daily. Every day should have within it new sources of inspiration and motivation, because every day of life is precious. And I hate to be the one to break this to you, but we don't have an unlimited supply of them. There's only so much time we have on this planet to write our stories and to create our own masterpieces. So what kind of stories are we writing? What kind of stories can be told about us? Whatever those may be, I assure you that it's not too late to start writing some new stories, and some good ones. It Doesn't have to be earth-shattering or mountain-moving to make it a good story. You don't have to cure cancer, although that would be good. You don't have to paint the Mona Lisa to create your masterpiece in life. If you take the time to visit someone in a hospital, or you visit a lonely senior in an assisted care facility, that's painting a masterpiece. That's a story worth telling. It can be just the act of raising children, of spending time with grandchildren. Not always headline-grabbing stuff. Not too much fanfare there, but if you raise them with good values, with healthy priorities, with a strong sense of their identity, those are masterpieces too. There was this woman that was once in a supermarket, and her 3-year-old girl was having one of those fits. Those are the fits that the kids know are reserved for supermarkets. It starts with whining, then it gets into crying, and then it gets to the screaming phase, then the jumping up and down in those carts, right? You try to put them in that little seat thing, but they're jumping all over the place. And then it becomes all guns blazing. Very calmly, this woman says, Sarah, don't cry. Very soon, you'll be home, and everything will be fine. The kid wouldn't let up. She launches into what we call the siren. The siren, you know what, that's that loud, screaming sound that takes place in the market. And still the mother keeps her voice calm. Sarah, please don't cry. In a few minutes, you'll be in the car on your way home, and all will be good. In the meantime, there's another shopper, and she's hearing the commotion as she's watching this, and she is so impressed how calm this mother is talking to this child. As this child is acting so obnoxiously, and the mother is calm. Wow. The demands get louder and louder. The fits get more animated. And she's staying cool. Sarah, don't cry. Soon it will be done. Soon you'll be home. You may even take a nap. The other shopper can't hold it in anymore. She comes over and says, I must tell you, I am so impressed how calmly you keep talking to little Sarah there. The mother says, oh, she's Rachel. I'm Sarah. So indeed, raising good children can be an artful masterpiece as well. But take any mitzvah where you can shine. Whether it's getting involved with your Chabad here, putting on tefillin, lighting Shabbat candles, volunteering your time for children with special needs, serving as a mentor for troubled teenagers, providing food and shelter for the poor, whatever resonates with your character and matches your inclination, make it your thing. Do it consistently, and do it passionately, and do it exceptionally, till it becomes your masterpiece, your Jewish story. Stories that will build bridges between you and your fellow. Stories that can create bonds between one generation and the next. Stories that can connect us between the world that we live in and the world above, in the heavenly world. The last Gaza war in 2008, the first Israeli soldier that was killed in that war was a young man by the name of Dvir Aminolov. And needless to say, Dvir's mother, Dalia Aminolov, was completely shattered. And she missed her Dvir terribly. A few weeks after the funeral, a few months go by, she couldn't sleep, and she begged God, I need to hear from my Dvir. Just let him come to me in a dream, some way, let me feel Dvir. That was her begging of God. I need to connect. I miss him too much. The pain is too great. That week, Dalia's daughter, her other daughter, asked her to accompany her to a musical performance that was taking place at the International Crafts Festival in Jerusalem. She was in no mood to go to any type of music festival, but she also recognized that her daughter needed some outlet as well to deal with her grief, and so she agreed to go. As it turns out, the concert was a bit delayed, as most Jewish events are. And they're waiting for the program to start. This 3-year-old precocious little boy began wandering restlessly throughout the stands. And he walks up to where Dahlia's sitting and touches her on the shoulder. And Dahlia was a preschool teacher, so she's used to dealing with little children. And Dahlia turns around and sees this sweet little kid there. And Dahlia says, "What's your name?" He says, "My name is Eshel." "That's such a nice name. Do you want to be my friend, Eshel?" And Eshel says, "Yes, I want to be your friend." So Dahlia made a new friend, little Eshel. Eshel's parents are sitting 2 rows up, and they're concerned that their little one was bothering this woman, so they were motioning him, "Come back here." And Dahlia's saying, "Don't worry about him. I can handle him. I can handle him." Out of the blue, this 3-year-old Eshel says to Dahlia, "I have a baby brother. His name is Dvir." And she's caught by surprise because she hears the name of her son. "Do you want to see my baby? Because my baby is here. Do you want to see my baby?" And with that, he starts tugging Mrs. Amenelov to come with him to see baby Dvir. Dahlia walks up with Eshel to where the parents are sitting, and she sees this beautiful baby. And she says, "Slicha, if you don't mind me asking, how old is your baby and when was he born?" And the mother says he was born right after the war in Gaza began. "And why did you choose the name Dvir?" And Dvir's mother began to explain. "When I was at the end of my pregnancy, literally the last 2 weeks, the doctor suspected that the fetus may have a very serious birth defect. And since it was already at the end of the pregnancy, there was little the doctors could do. There were little options, no options for me, and I just had to wait and see how things would turn out. When I came home from the doctor that night, obviously I was filled with anxiety and stress. The news reported the first casualty of the war, a soldier named Dvir. I was so saddened by the news, so I made a deal with God. And I said, "God, please, I'm begging you, give me a healthy son, and I will name this son Dvir after that soldier that was just killed." Dahlia, the mother of Dvir, stands with her mouth open. She tried to speak, but she couldn't. Finally, after a long silence, she says, "I'm Dvir's mother." The parents don't believe her. She says, "Yeah, I'm Dvir's mother. My name is Dahlia Aminalov." And with this sudden inspiration, baby Dvir's mother says, "Well, my Dvir wants to give you a hug." And she finds herself holding this baby, hugging this baby, remembering her begging of God, "Please give me a hug for my son," and realizes she's getting that hug right now. Some of you may have heard about this list. It came out years ago. Time magazine, it was Newsweek, did it for about 5 years in a row, this list called the 50 most influential rabbis in America. Anyone remember that? Well, we all remember it because we went looking, but none of us made it to that list. Every year they would do the 50 most influential rabbis in America. And the number 1 rabbi that they selected was Rabbi Yehuda Krinsky, the chairman of the Central Organizing Committee of Chabad. Of course, we were flattered that the leader, the administrator of Chabad made it to the top list, number 1 of all the 50 most influential rabbis in America. But we were a bit surprised, a bit curious, Rabbi Krinsky. What was odd about it is Rabbi Krinsky has no congregation. He doesn't have a synagogue. He doesn't give classes like we do. He doesn't do lectures. He doesn't organize any programs. He has an office in 770 Eastern Parkway. Why would they pick him? but it made perfect sense. And I assure you that I mean no disrespect to Rabbi Krinsky, because I think he would be the first one to sign on to my thesis here. It wasn't about Rabbi Krinsky. It was about the man for whom Rabbi Krinsky served as secretary and personal driver for some 40 years. It was about the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Schneerson. And because Rabbi Schneerson was no longer alive in the physical world at the time that they came up with this list, but yet he still has more influence than any other rabbi in the world. So they picked his secretary. And they made his secretary the #1 most influential rabbi. You see, this is the spirit and vitality of the Jewish story. When your story is that powerful, you can be physically absent for some 30 years and still be the most present person on earth. It's a phenomenon as old as Judaism itself. One of the most popular of all Jewish songs, David, Melech Israel, right? What are you saying? Chai, Chai, V'Chai. What does that mean? What does that mean? David, king of Israel, lives and endures. Chai V'Chai. Every Jew on the face of the earth sings that song. Is King David alive? It's not the memory of King David. It says he is alive. What do you mean he's alive? He died. He was buried. There are monuments. How can you say he lives? And the answer is his story lives. His writings live. His inspiration lives. His masterpiece lives. And therefore he lives. Ladies and gentlemen, before I conclude, I'm going to share with you one of the most devastating events of my youth, not just of my youth, but all those that grew up at that period of time in the Crown Heights section of Brooklyn. Back in our neighborhood, there was a sweet boy. His name was Avremi. Avremi was a very studious, sincere, and sensitive boy. He was a few years older than me, but I knew him because we sang together in a children's choir, and that's where I got to know him. He had an exceptionally beautiful voice. He was a soloist on many albums back in those days. He was around 16 years old at the time of this story. He studied in a Chabad yeshiva in Crown Heights called Ole Torah. If you know the streets in Crown Heights, it's located on Troy Avenue in Crown Heights. One night, Avremi approached one of his friends in the yeshiva, and they discussed a certain phone call that he felt that they should make together. In those days, we didn't have cell phones. So how did you make a phone call? Do you remember what we had? Phone booths, right? There were pay phones, but there were also places that had a phone booth. It was an actual booth. It had a door. You went in. So there was a phone booth just up the street on Troy Avenue, 1 block from the yeshiva. Avremi and his friend walked the block to the phone booth. Avremi went into the phone booth. His friend waited right outside the booth with the door open. Avremi made the phone call, and he was in the thick of his conversation when 3 hooligans approached the boy that was standing outside the booth. They didn't demand anything. They didn't say a word. One of them pulled out an ice pick from the inside of his jacket and thrust it at the boy that was standing outside the phone booth. By reflex, the boy jumped back, and the weapon struck only air. The hooligans then turned their attention to the boy inside the booth. Unfortunately, he had nowhere to run. He was stuck in the booth. And they thrust him 3 times in the chest. Their blood mission accomplished, the hooligans ran off. The standing boy grabbed his friend and began running him back to the yeshiva, yelling for help. The ambulance came quickly. Avremi was rushed to the hospital, but by the time he arrived, he was already gone. The family of this beautiful young man was broken. The entire community, especially all of us youth, were in a state of total shock. This was a friend. We could not come to terms with the idea that a friend of ours was murdered in our neighborhood. As you can imagine, back then, nobody was all too interested in the minor details of what happened that night. For example, who were they calling? Why was it so important that they make that phone call? Why, when his parents went into Avremi's bedroom, did they find a bag with a bottle of wine and some cookies? None of that really seemed to matter in the greater scheme of things. The darkness was too great for such things to matter to the parents. The boy outside the booth was too consumed with shock and grief, coupled with the trauma of having to face the murderers and testify against them in court. So he shut down and rarely spoke as to what happened that night. Let's fast forward. 33 years after this tragedy. The boy who was standing outside the booth that night, now a grown man, a father and a grandfather himself, and a very dear friend of mine, and a dear friend of all of yours. His name is Shmulik in the Parsnik. He gets a phone call. It's from one of Avremi's brothers, who you also know quite well, lives here in Los Angeles. His parents want to know. They want some missing pieces filled in about that night. 33 years later, they have questions. So the family wants to know from Shmulik, why were you out there that night? Who were you calling? Who was Avremi on the phone with at his last moments of life? So Shmulik proceeded to tell them the missing pieces. He explained that he and Avremi would go on what we call a Miftzayim route. On Fridays, us yeshiva boys were sent to different parts of Brooklyn and Manhattan and Queens to visit with Jewish storekeepers, Jewish offices, and put on tefillin with them. If it was women, giving them Shabbos candles. This was a way of breaking us in at a very young age and giving an opportunity for Jews who wouldn't have this opportunity to put on tefillin or to connect, to have someone visiting them. Shmulik and Avremi would go to a particular row of stores. These were garment stores, and most of them were owned by Jews. And we would go store to store every Friday. We would put on film with the owners. One of the regular stops that we have, the owner was quite secular, but he always welcomed us. He always tolerated us. And one week we show up and he tells us that his wife just had a baby girl. So we wished him a mazel tov. And then we got into this whole conversation, how this might be a good time for your wife to start lighting the Shabbat candles after such a blessing. And then they proceeded to encourage the man. Why don't you come this Monday morning? It's Friday now. Come this Monday to 770 Eastern Parkway. The Lubavitcher Rebbe comes out for the reading of the Torah. we'll meet you there, and you'll give your new baby a Jewish name. Wouldn't that be beautiful? In front of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, you'll give your baby a Jewish name. So he says, look, I'm not religious. You guys know that. And I didn't give my other kids Jewish names. And it's not for me. And we argued with him. Come on. It's such a great idea. It's such a great blessing. It'll bring blessing to your daughter. She will be blessed. You will be blessed. It's such a... And he said, all right, you know what? I'll think about it. That's what he said. I'll think about it. So we went. We bought a bottle of wine and some cookies because we thought he was going to show up. It's Sunday night. And Avrami comes to me and says, I have a feeling he's going to be a no-show. So why don't we call him and really tighten it and say, hey, come on, we're going to be there. We already have the wine. We have the cookies. Just one subway. Just get off of Kingston Avenue and you're right there. And so I said, okay, let's go make that call. And it was with this father that Avremi was conversing that fateful night in the phone booth. Those words would be his last. Trying to convince someone to give his baby a Jewish name. Shmulik finishes telling Avremi's brother, and Avremi's brother says, thank you, that explains a lot for us. So Shmulik says, okay, I answered all your questions, now you have to answer a question of mine. What's your question? Why now? 33 years later, you're asking me these questions? What triggered your parents to want to have these answers now? So he said, last night, my parents got a phone call. It was a woman from Israel. She said, my name is Pam, but I go by my Hebrew name, Pesha. You don't know me, but I need to tell you a little bit about myself. I came from a secular family. None of my siblings are religious. But I, for some reason, I always had not just a curiosity, but this intense thirst for spirituality. And although I didn't receive a Jewish education, I tried to learn whatever I could, whenever I could. And several years ago, I made Aliyah to Israel. I attended a Jewish study program, and sure enough, I started learning and leading a totally observant lifestyle. She went on to say, one time my father came to visit me, and he said, there's something you should know. When you were born, these two yeshiva boys came to see me. And they insisted that I go to the synagogue and give you a Jewish name at the Torah the following Monday morning. I didn't want to go. And that Sunday night, one of them called me. And he was talking to me about the importance of doing this for you. My dear daughter, he was killed while I was having the conversation with him about you. It was all over the news. I heard the scream, but I didn't know what happened. And then I turn on the news and I hear that in Crown Heights, a boy on the phone was stabbed to death. I knew it was him. There was no way I could not respect this young boy's dying wish. And so I went to the synagogue and I gave you a Jewish name, Pesha. During that week, I went to the house of Shiva. But I saw the pain on Avremi's parents' face, and I couldn't bring myself to say a word to them. I just saw the raw pain. For years, I put this whole story out of my mind. But now, my dear daughter, I see how devoted you are to your Jewish heritage. Unlike any of the other siblings, you have made this part of your life. You've made Aliyah. You keep Shabbat. You keep kosher. Everything you do. I thought you should know the story that took place when you were born. This is what this woman is telling Avremi's parents over the phone. She said, not long after telling me this story, my father passed away. He died young. But I'm so grateful that he shared the story with me before leaving this world, because you see, all along I've always felt that there's something up there that's pushing me, and I could never explain it. And even in therapy sessions, if I would try to explain, I feel something above is pushing me. They would think there's something really wrong with me. But I knew there was a force, there was a spiritual force coming from another world pushing me. But I could never understand it. And then I hear this story. And I believe that it's thanks to that tug from above that I'm so fortunate to be leading the life that I am. I now have two beautiful sons, she tells the parents, Eldad and Aviv, who are attending yeshiva. And I want you to know that this is all because of your son, Avrem. So how did I find you? Well, I did the research. Not hard to find a murder in Crown Heights that took place 33 years ago. I checked it up. I found your family name. I looked up your phone number. And I'm on the phone with you now. And although I'm sure you already know this, but what an honor it was for you, what a privilege to have brought such a lofty soul into this world, even though you only had him for 16 years. I hope you will agree to see me. I'd like to come to New York and visit and be part of the family. 33 years after this most horrific tragedy, these parents finally get to hear the rest of the story, or at least part of it. I've told this story at a JLI retreat that was videotaped, that was put out there on YouTube. And soon thereafter, I got a phone call. My name is Pesha. I've watched the story on YouTube. I want you to know that I now have 4 or 5 children. I want to send you the picture. And the next son we named after Avremi. She wanted me to put her in touch with all the members of the family, with Shmulik, and I've done all of that. I've stayed now in close touch with Pesha all these years since telling the story. So many of our Jewish stories remain unfinished. Each and every day we pray for a time when we'll finally be able to learn the rest of the stories so that we can put everything in our lives into proper context, so that we finally have more answers than we have questions. In the meantime, we must hear the stories. We must share the stories. But there are our lifelines to our essence. We must sit with our children and our grandchildren and tell them the stories of their heritage and their ancestors, but not just to tell it to them with passion, tell it to them with excitement, tell it to them with enthusiasm, make them come alive. In conclusion, I ask you to imagine for a moment. Just imagine with me. Imagine you travel to the heavenly world. We're not going for long term, we're just going for a visit. And when we get to the heavenly world, we see there's this magnificent library. Mahogany wood, beautiful bookcases, all organized. Beautiful volumes there, leather bound, every single one. And then we notice that there are letters outside each volume. A, B, C, or Aleph, Bet, Gimel, not sure exactly which way. Any way that your mind and your fascination wants to take you. And what you discover in this huge library is that every volume is about a person's life. It's literally the God-written diary of every person that existed. So what do we each do automatically? We start racing, looking for our name. We want to read our story. We want to read our book. And we find it. And we pull it off the shelf. And we start reading it. It's about the day we were born. And it tells us everything as we were growing up. What school, what kindergarten our parents sent us to. It's all there. It's all so vivid. It's coming to life. Every story is written so accurately. Things I forgot that happened. It's all there. And I keep turning the pages. I can't let go of this book. And then I get to a page and it says, Sunday, March 30th, 2025. You're sitting at the Chabad house in Pasadena, California. And the sentence stops. There's many pages left, but they're blank. Go write your story now. Thank you for having me.
Yasher Koyach. Yasher Koyach, Yasher Koyach. A big thank you to Rabbi Bryski